Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The time right now is 5:57. We will be waiting until 6 p.m. to start the webinar. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The time is 6 p.m. We're going to wait 2 more minutes just to facilitate the entry to everyone joining our webinar. Happy Friday, everyone. On behalf of our team at the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies, I would like to welcome you to the third of our Sears in Conversation web series. Thank you for spending your Friday evening with us. Tonight's conversation will be on the spatiality of Blacknesses in academia. Now, before we start, I would like to begin with acknowledging the land on which we are hosted. The sacred land on which we are hosted has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and the allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is home to a large Indigenous population, including residential school survivors and intergenerational family members who have been impacted by the history and legacy of the residential school system. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to be hosted on this land. Once again, thank you all for joining us. The moderators and Dr. George Day are all united here in conversation around the spatiality of Blacknesses. My name is Rukia Mohammed, and I am a Somali Muslim Black woman. I am an educator within the Toronto District School Board and also a graduate assistant researcher at OISE University of Toronto. I will be co-moderating tonight with Dr. Ahmed Ilmi. Dr. Ahmed Ilmi is the Provost Postdoctoral Fellowship in Black Studies in the Department of Social Justice Education. His research is in Black boys education, and he has a long history completing both his master's and doctoral research within the Department of Social Justice at OISE University of Toronto. We are all humbled by your desire to critically engage in this experience and privileged to share this space with you all. Ahmed?
Oh, Rukia, thank you so much for the very warm introduction. Before I begin, I would like to thank the Sears Working Group, Julia, Reshhan, Mary Khan, Shiva, Zainab, Sherlin, and Rukia. Thank you very much. This event wouldn't have been possible without your dedication and hard work. My name is Ahmed Elmi. Friends, colleagues, members of the greater community, welcome to the Spirituality of Blackness in the Academy. This is a very, very important talk as we think of anti-Black racism that is now in the forefront when we think of the University of Toronto in light of everything that's happened over the course of the summer and over the last few years with Black Lives Matter and the struggles with Black communities around the world, essentially, in terms of addressing anti-Black racism. And this is the first inaugural talk that we decided to give as a part of the Department of Social Justice Education, also in the middle of the pandemic. So it's not just anti-Blackness, but a pandemic. This is a very, very important conversation. Therefore, we decided to invite a leading intellectual in the area of anti-Black racism within the Academy. Oh, my screen just died. Give me a second. Within the Academy, over the course of my years at OISE, I've always witnessed George speak for Black people, be the only voice essentially there pushing, advocating for addressing anti-racism issues and anti-Blackness. And therefore, we decided to have this conversation in this talk. And I was tasked with the task of introducing George Day. George Day, sorry, my screen froze, is a Ghanaian-born scholar. Ghanaian-born George Cephade is a renowned educator, researcher, writer who's considered by many as one of Canada's leading scholars in anti-racism education and studies. He is widely sought after as an academic researcher and community worker whose professional academic work has led to many invitations, speaking engagements in the US, Europe, and Africa, and essentially around the world. Currently, he is professor of social justice education and director of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies at the University of Toronto, Ontario, at OISE, one of Canada's first centers for integrative anti-racism, addressing issues of race and anti-racism education. And the center was started by Professor George Day, Shireen Razak, and the late Rosanna Ng, and it was started in the mid-90s. So again, talking about the history of the study of racism and anti-Blackness at the University of Toronto. Professor Day is the 2015, 2016, 2018, and 19 Carrigan African Diasporan Fellow. In August 2012, Professor Day received the honorary title of Professor Extraordinaire from the Department of Inclusive Education, University of South Africa, UNISA. In 2017, he was elected as a Fellow of Royal Society of Canada, the most prestigious award an academic and a scholar can receive in Canada. He also received the 2016 Woodworth Award for Educational Research from the Canadian Association, awarded for Canadian scholars whose research, scholarship, and activism has reshaped Canadian society. He is the 2019 Polo Ferry Democratic Project Champaign University Social Justice Award winner. And in 2020, he holds the Devaux DeBell Extraordinary Fellow in Afrocentric Research at Delmore Buddy Dell Learning Institution, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Finally, in 2007, Professor Day was installed as a traditional chief in Ghana, specifically as the Geshahene of the town of Asquar, and as a traditional chief, and his stool name is Nana Dese Sefa Tenaboa. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Yes. Without further ado, welcome everyone, and I would like to welcome Professor Day to give us a talk about the spirituality of Blackness. Thank you for spending your evening with us.
Now, before we get started, we just want to go over some of the key areas that we're going to focus on. So Dr. George Day is going to draw upon the lessons from his personal travelogue of Black African body in academia to articulate the spatiality of Blacknesses. Dr. Day situates body, politics, land, and geographies in discursive analysis and political practice for educational change. The discussions that you're going to witness today and be a part of highlights what it means to talk about Blacknesses, the effects of geospaces of Blacknesses for progressive politics in the academy, and its implications for the Black scholar and Black scholarship within the current global context of anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism. Now, beyond the interrogation of capitalist consumption of Blacknesses, Dr. George Day, throughout his presentation tonight and the conversation that we're going to be engaging in, wants us to think about the when, the why, and the how of Black existence comes into mainstream public consciousness, and what it would take to make the paradox of asking us to understand working class angst, anger with the economic system, and however, in the process of that, deny Black rage, pain, and suffering. So within the conversation today, there are going to be some key questions that Dr. Day is going to engage in. And this was in the abstract that you all read as you were registering for this webinar. The first is, how does the spatiality of Blacknesses within the confines of institutions get instrumentalized? The second is, what does this look like within our institutions? Furthermore, how is the historical spatialization of whiteness and the territoriality of whiteness contested by Blacknesses? How is this resisted? How do racial spatiality and space-making gestures of Blacknesses become forms of institutional accounting? And lastly, how are Black scholars envisioning and architecting new technologies of space-making that allow for the insurrection, disaffected and unruly Black scholar to be and to inhabit space within the academia? Now, before Dr. Day begins, we would just like to let you know that for everyone watching, please join our conversation on social media using the hashtag Sears and Conversation, Sears and Convo, CONVO, one word. You can also access this webinar on YouTube and Facebook Live. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be available to you afterwards as well on YouTube. You can follow us on Twitter at capital Oise, OISE, Sears, CIARS. And all information, again, will be available to you afterwards. The format of this session is as follows. So Dr. Day, for about an hour, will be engaging in a deep examination of tonight's themes. Then we will have about a 5-minute break or so, and then engage in a 30 minutes of live Q&A with the audience based on the questions that were submitted during registration. As we engage in this conversation tonight, there will be new or more questions that you have, so please include them in the Q&A chat. All of these curiosities will inform future work with Sears and future webinars. So as you're listening and taking notes, if there are questions that you'd like for the center to explore further, please just include them in the Q&A chat and we will be documenting them. Lastly, we will end with our closing remarks. So we're going to end around 8 p.m. Our volunteers and coordinators who have worked really hard to organize this webinar will come on screen and share any further community updates within the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies. So without further ado, Dr. Day, it's all yours.
Thank you. I know we've already done the land acknowledgement, but I think it's very important to repeat that because for me, I think the teachings of the land and also the support of our elders and ancestors is so important for the work that we all do. So I think we can't repeat it enough, but also what the teachings tell us in terms of what it means to act, to bring about the change that we all want. I also want to thank the organizers. I know a lot of work has gone into this. This was originally a small idea, and then now it's matured into a very big one. I know there are people who are in the room from all over the world. I know there are family from Ghana, Africa. There are also colleagues from the continent, from Latin America, US, and of course, other parts of Canada, and some of my whose work I admire are also listening in. So I want to welcome everyone to that. Also, in particular, I also want to thank the department, particularly the events committee headed by Dr. Elmi, the social justice department, but also the center and the students of the center who has been at the backbone. And of course, the Demo by the Dale Institute, Learning Institute in Halifax, who have been partnering with CS over the few years. I want to locate myself as my membership in the Asechi clan of Ghana, which is one of the clans of the Akan, the Ashanti. And for this clan, our animal spirit is the vulture. And we know that the vulture, for example, scavages on the rubbish dump. And the indigenous mythology is that it's simply to get the point across that you can make something useful from that which has been discarded. And that has been something that has carried with me in terms of the way I talk about community, the way I work. But there's also a saying in the Akan language, which goes this way, that Ufie nipa everyone nama ekebi. Literally what it means is family runs deep. The whole idea of community runs deep. The community is there to support you. The community is there to back you up, but it's also to advise and also to, in many ways, tell you when you're wrong, so that you learn the path to success, and it becomes a collective success. And these teachings have guided me in my journey in academia. And so for me, I talk about coming to know and knowing and speaking differently. And this is so important because I remember as a faculty at OIG one time, I did write something to the University Affairs in which somebody was critiquing what I'd said. And a former colleague of the department, Professor Helen Lenski, wrote back and said, you should have maybe read the title of what he said, Speaking Differently. We come to know and to speak differently. And I think we all come to our knowledge and knowledging from the particular place, the history, the culture, and the politics, as others like Stuart Hall have talked about. So I'm coming to you in terms of speaking and coming to know different, and I want you to keep that in mind. But I'm also a student of Fanon, and I think I work with Fanon's exhortation when Fanon says, quote, "Oh, my body makes me a human or a man," he actually said. Who questions? This means then that I'm training in this way not only in terms of how we make sense, but also how we question and think about possibilities for future. And for me, as a Black scholar, as a Black learner, as a Black community worker, the whole idea of resisting the intellectual nothingness, where as if we don't mean anything, and rather affirm our ethnicness of Black thought, the ethnicness of what I call Black thought, is very, very important to me. And it's through this journey that I've come to find my voice and also find my center through self, claimings of self, claiming of community, and a place to talk back, as long time ago, people like Amy Cesare and Bell Hooks talked about, right? We talked about it in terms of this idea of finding voice, center, and talking back. So talking back to even questions of power in that regard. Now, I want to start with some terms, and I'm going to be a bit dry here, but I think to me, I think theory is important, but I want to make a couple of points here in terms of, I have always maintained that the worth of a theory is measured along two fronts. One is the philosophical grounding of that theory, but more importantly, in terms of that ability of the theory to offer a social and political corrective. As far as I'm concerned, the theory is not worth talking about if it doesn't help us to offer a social and political corrective. You can talk all about the philosophical principles and the opinions of that theory, but how does it help us? And this is why, to me, clarification of terms and conceptualization is important. But I also recall, meeting my students at OISI, and we were having this study group discussion, the students saying, but George, at that time I was in Nana, so he said, but George, all these things about epistemology, why don't we find our own terms, epistemology, ontology, and so forth? And I said, you're making a very excellent point, but you see, this is where the conundrum is. For a Black scholar, if you don't speak that language, you're going to be marked as anti-intellectual, right? So we may, of course, we want to talk about pioneering new analytical systems, as others have talked about, for understanding our own realities and our own existence. But we also have to understand the frameworks, the theories, and how we come to sense making. And this is big for us. We cannot afford not also to show that, because there's a narrative that some of us don't even have theory when we speak. And we need to trouble that. We need to trouble that. I think we live theory every day. We speak it, we engage it, and it's been part and parcel of our lives. We don't name it the way as academics we name it. We know when our mothers, our grandmothers tell us a story, there's a theory behind that story. So what conceptualization do I bring? And let me just spend a few moments here because it's very, very important. The title talks about the academy. I'm talking about the academy along certain fronts. One, of course, it's an institution, but it's an institution where particular practices of knowledge production, interrogation, validation, and dissemination are cultivated, right? And sometimes what happens is that we know there's a discipline and a regulation around that. But it's also a neoliberal space. And we talk about it in the sense which it has become a colonial structure, where we have bodies who occupy lands and places, coming at it with different histories, experiences, in the context of racial capitalism, the power of racial capitalism, the whole notion about the political economy of the Western academy, how we have been sucked into it, and the political contestations that come with it. But it's also a place where we cultivate different academic identities. So I speak to you as a Black scholar, a Black male, heterosexual scholar, as somebody will speak to you as a Black queer scholar, a Black disabled scholar. And these are all the academic identities that we navigate, that we take with it and we work. And I think also the fact that the academy reveals, and this is so important for this presentation, how spaces are consequential. It's not just how we occupy spaces, how our bodies are read when we occupy these spaces, and what these spaces mean in terms of navigating the academic landscape. Blacknesses. I'm looking at Blacknesses in terms of its architecture and the fugativeness of it. So when I talk of Blacknesses, I'm talking of Blackness, but I'm also talking of anti-Blackness. You have to take the two, and that's why the plural is. But it's also plural in terms of disrupting hegemonic Blackness. There's not one narrative of speaking about Blackness. There's a multiple narratives. Then some of those narratives get into questions about the cartographies, the different landscapes of speaking about Blacknesses. I'm also looking at it in terms of how there are many, many scholars who speak about it, and we can't do justice. And there are many, many scholars who are out there who are speaking about it. But what they all bring is the different lenses that speak to the totality, the complexity, but also the contested and sometimes the complicated Black essentialities in our lived experiences and how we construct particular identities on lands, place, and geographies. And there are many scholars that I've listed here that we can talk about, whether it's Tessin Hooks, Kane, Asante, McKettrick, Walcott, Ibrahim Sharp, Dumas, Cooper, Marlon Simmons, Carl James, Anna Chenry, Paula J., Philip Howard, Wright, Rosalind Hampton, McCune, and Hartman. And so forth, there are many, many scholars to speak on that. But I'm also speaking about the Blacknesses in terms of the centeredness of Black intellectual thought and the cultural practices and the Black spatial politics that come with this centering. So the whole term now becomes Black centricity. It's a form of Black centricity. But it's also Blacknesses that affirm our Blackness as an antidote to Afrophobia, as George King a long time ago said. That's fear of Blackness. So affirming the Blacknesses to speak as an antidote to Afrophobia. And in doing so, to bring a discursive relationality to space, to land, history, identity, and the question of difference. What about spatiology, which is also a term that comes up in the title? I'm looking at the spatiological relations of the universe and the cosmogonies, the ontologies and the epistemologies that come with that in terms of the land and the geographies. But I'm also looking at it the way people have talked about it, whether they talk about the racialization of space or the specialization of race and the intersections of race and difference in geographic occupations. So a former colleague, Shane Razak, wrote a book about this. I know the Money Grounds, Captain McKettrick, writes these issues. And of course, a colleague of mine too, Tanya Tiscotti, in their work on disability and space. I think Griffin makes a very, very important point, and that is to context, it's to address or to respond to the context of a space and to see it as symbolic of a larger context over Black bodies when you bring it to the Black body. That is, it's symbolic, but it also speaks about a larger context over Black body. And then Omi Emunas in the work on racial formation, right? I think to me, that spatiology also speaks to how this racial formation is given a spatial expression, which is integral to the analysis of power. In other words, how racial formation shapes space, gives meanings to place, and condition the experiences of embodied subjects who are in place, the word is in place, in and moving through material worlds, as Delaney talks about. So these bodies are in place, they are put in place, and they move through material worlds in that sense. But also the spatiology also addresses the question of how spaces are produced within ideologies of, for example, color blindness. So we have the whole discussion around integration, assimilation, or even coming to racial consciousness when we get into certain spaces where we talk about separatist politics or even nativist discourse. But also the intersections of questions of gender, sexuality, disability, notions about citizenship, democracy, and to see this as all constitutive of power leading specialities of everyday life, as Delaney also talks about. But I'm also talking about the spatiology in terms of the idea of a space as a color line theory, and go back to Du Bois a long time ago in a piece that he wrote, right? And this color line theory, the way it denies, in our course, opportunities and privileges of, quote, modern civilization. Of course, we can't talk about the spatiology without getting to the question of land and place literacies. epistemes of life, how we come to understand life, how we make sense of life, our existence in particular places, and also as Sandra Stiles and others, Ian Simpson, when they talk about these notions about the ontologies of space, and also my colleague Eve Chad and McKinsey, when they talk about these notions about space and how space mean in terms of the bodies who occupy these spaces. Then the big term, physiology of blacknesses. I think there's no doubt that blackness has been very central to both the production of space and to the formation of Western neocentric forms of place belonging in geographic knowledge. And others write about this. The whole notion about black subjects as, quote, ungeographic, that McKittrick talks about, black issues where progress, voyaging, and rationality meet violence, enslavement, and are worked out in geography, in space and place, in the physical world. And then the notion of black geographies. So black geographies in terms of, from analysis of the diaspora to the plantation, from studies of urban segregation to anti-colonial circuits of displacement and resistance that reveal black thought as a thought which is always concerned with matters of time, place, power, as Hawthorne in the book Black Space Matters also writes about. But of course, in this spatiality of blacknesses, there's a mapping of blacknesses. And that mapping of blacknesses is around a space-time continuum where the grammar of black futurity can be thought of and is understood in a time of the connections between the past, the present, and the future. And Sylvia Susiquenki, the Bolivian anti-colonial feminist scholar, talks about, quote, the vision of history, which is not linear, nor is it teleological, but it rather moves in circles and spirals and sets out a course without neglecting to return to the same point, unquote. So this notion of the spiral, so the past, the present, and the future are connected, right? We reclaim the past, we reflect on the future, we reflect on the present, and we project on the future. And of course, the whole notion of spatial literacies, as Black feminist scholars like Amy Adari are talking about. So a critical literacy of space and how it affects our spatial configurations, social practices, and our sense of place through a feminist and Africana womanist lens. And there's a quote that I like here when she talks about it in terms of Black women are disproportionately represented worldwide in unsuitable and inadequate spatial allocations, for example, urban settlements. And they are also disproportionately underrepresented in spatial development decision-making processes. There are other meanings too, and there's a whole notion about Black visuality. And this is how the Black body in its visual representation, there are meanings that are attached to it. These meanings circulate around the Black body and how these meanings define linear time. In effect, what I'm saying is that Blackness demands its own grammar, given our historic disruptions. It demands its own grammar, given our historic disruptions. And so one grammar would be the grammar of Black feminist futurity, for example, which is, quote, a grammar of possibility, moving from what will be, which is a future, to that which will have happened, which is a future perfect tense. But it's also strives for a particular future, and that future is a future which is real, but it's conditional, that which will have had to happen. Now, I talk about this in a different way, where I talk about looking at Africa, for example. Colonialism has been an interrupter. So there's always a question that we should continually ask, which is what might have been. We will never know what might have been. And this is that future rare conditional that we need to ask. And what this brings is that it calls for how we navigate around politics of prefiguration, as Counts talks about, involving living the future now. Living in the future now and striving for a future now and in the present, unquote. But we can't talk of the speciality of Blacknesses without also engaging Black and African erasures. We see it in Africa, we see it in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Black diaspora in terms of a global theorizing of that speciality of Blacknesses. For example, not to leave African indigeneity out when we talk about it. Also, to recognize the pre-colonial and the pre-enslavement existence of Afro-descendants with indigenous peoples in Latin America and the diaspora, whether we are looking at it in Brazil, Ecuador, Chile, and the discourses of race, nationality, and the emergence of new political Black identities in this context. So in the global sense, this is what I'm speaking to in terms of the Spatiality, but I'll later on want to bring it to the academy, how we can navigate this and engage in this in the academy. But in terms of the Black erasures, we also have to bring what I'll call an anti-colonial racial analysis to the study of Blacknesses in African context. Because sometimes what you hear is that, oh, Black is meaningless in Africa. Is this meaningful? It is meaningful in terms of that unspoken influences of anti-Blackness, anti-African racisms, including the daily chokeholds on African existence. The way whiteness, quote, a racial difference remains central in present-day geographies of extraction. Right? People extract your resources because they don't think you are human. They take your resources because they think you are subhuman. You don't deserve it. So these processes, these present-day processes of extraction of resources from Africa is informed by a particular thinking of Blackness. And of course, partisans were the social death, that in doing so, there's a social death of racial ventriloquism, which is to say, those who speak on behalf of Africa and African peoples. They forget this idea that nothing about us without us. They put it aside and they speak on behalf of us. They speak on behalf of African peoples, they speak on behalf of Africa. And so this is so important to set the terms in terms of the concept and conceptualizations that I bring to the thinking around the speciality of Blacknesses in academia. Now, in this paper, in this discussion, I want to take some discursive stances, and I just want to make them very, very clear. What are some of these discursive stances? I think I want to situate it in my personal academic travelogue, but it's not just the personal experience or the particularity of that experience. That experience needs to be theorized, as Judith Butler talks about experience in need of theorization. So how you connect it to a structure, and also how you connect it to questions of difference, that these experiences are raised, they are classed, they are gendered, they are sexualized. The second discursive stand is this idea that academic spaces are not innocent. The Black spaces has been a place of injury, a place of pain, and a place of vulnerability. But it's also a place of Black affirmations, a place of love, resistance, and liberation. A third discussion stance is the fact that when we look at the Black existence in academia, Black excellence always elicits close scrutiny and skepticism. There's also that prevailing culture of whiteness, the daily whiteness of the academy, that culture of whiteness. And we need to understand it. And my point is that we can only understand it through a Black-white prism, not a Black-white binary, but a Black-white prism, which is, it allows us to examine the how and the why a closer proximity to whiteness is rewarded, while on the contrary, that proximity to Blackness is punished. And this is something that I've written about. I also wrote a piece of Andra Varkes who wrote about, but also built on people like Dat Sylvia and to some extent even Smith, this Black-white prism, while a closer proximity to whiteness is rewarded. And it's in all academic spaces, just as it's in all geographic spaces. The another discursive stance, which is also important for us to work with, is that there are Black scholar complicities and responsibilities. We are seduced by the political economy of academia. We know it. Sometimes we study our communities from a distance. We study our communities from a distance. Or sometimes we put our communities under the bus because we want to be validated. We want to be legitimized as the scholars. So we put our communities under the bus. So rather than understanding what is going on in our community, we go on talking about all the problems of the community. We put the community under the bus. Then there's also the Black denouncements. Sometimes also the intellectual grandstanding, where people mimic these theories, right? And it has no legs. It's just academic intellectual grandstanding. And then also there's the struggle over meanings and purpose of Black scholar identity and Black scholarship as spokesman. And I'll come back to this later. Another discursive stance is to argue that the university must start with us, Black and Indigenous students, faculty, and staff, rather than claiming to be doing things for us. Then there's also that quotidian practice of Black refusal in academia. The refusal to be refused, because we are being refused, but we refuse to be refused. There's also that refusal to stay in one's proper place. This is our assigned place, but we refuse to stay there. And we refuse to accept the very premise that have reduced our lived experiences of Blackness to pathology and reconcilability in the logic of white supremacy, as Kant talks about. So that refusal to be refused can be boxed. I think it's also important to look at that discussion stand which says the university as a possible place of refuge. So we go to the university to learn, and I agree, we go to the university to learn. We go there, there's a possibility of acquiring critical knowledge. But it's definitely, it's not a place of enlightenment. It is not a place of enlightenment. In other words, what I'm saying is that it is a place for us to be in, but not of it. We are in, but we shouldn't allow it to make us. So we are in it because we deserve to be there, but we shouldn't let it make us. So we deserve it. It's a place for us to be in, but not of it. And this is the place, and it's the path that we get to that subversive intellectual. And this is the point, you see, and Mortimer and Haney talk about it. The university needs what she bears. So we are products of the university. But the university cannot bear us. It cannot bear what she brings. So we go through, become scholars, become learners, become community workers. But then we take stances that the university cannot bear. This then leads to something that some of us have been thinking about really. To ask the question, what are the redeeming qualities of our institutions? Think about what are redeeming qualities of our institutions. Or we move towards a new academy, as Alo Kempf long time ago talked this notion about where we talk about a new academy. And for me, what I took from that in terms of conversation really was a key question about really what we should be talking about is what university is worth fighting for. What university is worth fighting for. So I want to bring history and context in terms of my subject location here. It is very, very clear that I'm speaking from a positionality of my Black scholar lived experience. And this has been experience or lived experience of privilege, I agree. It's also been an experience of complicity. I've been complicit in the very things I'm critiquing. But I'm also speaking from a position where I'm appreciative. I bring humility and also want to pursue resistance. I'm appreciative of the knowledge that I've worked, learned, working with students, working with some colleagues, and working with the community, and to bring humility to that. But I also want to talk about the harsh and violent lessons of the personal traveler for a Black body who has been working on race, anti-racism, African indigeneity, and anti-colonialism over the years, over 30 years. The death threats that has been received, the verbal threats that even continue to this day. When now we have a case or somebody even will write to the university administration that I teach my students to hate white people. And then there's pushback. There's a pushback when we talk about these issues. There's a pushback when we talk about these issues. But the good thing is that we have been sustained, and personally for me, I've been sustained and energized by local community, by the students and faculty colleagues. So I'm talking here in terms of this traveler, where, for example, coming to the University of Toronto and listen to Black community politics as it's articulated by the late Dudley Laws, Charles Roach, the Black Action Defense Committee, Leonard Farrell, and the Diversity Boycott Group, asking the university to boycott its funding from South Africa. And listen to these speakers speak about the importance of Black politics. But also in terms of the sustaining by students, there's a long tradition of students I've worked with. The Pat Ronnies, the Spencers, the Simmons, the Lawsons, the Zines, to the contemporaries like the Jimenez, the Christinas, the Ruquias, the Mary Carmens, of course, the Sulis that I've worked with. And the knowledge, they have been my best teacher. And of course, the faculty colleagues, the Sherin Razaks, the Roxana Ings, Carrie Daly, and many others. But also part of that institutional travelogue is this awareness that there continues to be that institutional appropriations and complicities, as well as regulation of Black space. The colonial investments that are very difficult to get rid of. Where diversity becomes a calling card, the university uses diversity as a calling card. Blackness becomes a flagship. And while all this is going on, we have to question the lack of sustained support for Black learners. The denouncements of Blackness and that not so subtle and subtle counterattacks on certain forms of Black scholarship. The anti-colonialisms, the Afrocentricities, and the subtle attacks on these scholarships. Then the embeddedness of anti-Blackness within our institutional cultures. We talk about Black only when Blackness is not in the room. But also, part of this travelogue is about academic courage. The academic courage where people maintain that distinctive voice, the distinctive Black voice, and they cannot be pushed around. But that courage also comes to face sometimes with the intellectual gymnastics and the cowardian. The intellectual gymnastics and the cowardian. Where you see it in terms of that escapes from race. Now I talk sometimes about you can be a Black scholar in the academy and not talk about race. and you'll be loved. You'll be seen as intellectual. They just start speaking about race, and all of a sudden you hear the responses. Always angry, chip on your shoulder. So that escapes from race and the Blacknesses. And also the politics of territoriality that I learned from one of my students a long time ago, Abraham. And this politics of territoriality is where we do have sometimes even Black learners who will come to these institutions thinking that they got there because they were smart, because they were A pluses. That's why they got there. They forget the history that has created the possibility for us to be where we are. The struggles that have made it possible for us to be where we are. So they forget the politics of coming to that space, what it means. And that politics means you continue to fight to make the door wide open for other bodies to come in. That yes, we got in because we are smart, because we are the A pluses, but there's more to the story. Because those other bodies who didn't get in, did not get in just simply because they were not the A's and the A pluses. People had to fight to create these spaces. So some of that intellectual gymnastics and the coward into that I've seen, right? Also can be seen in terms of the way we make strategic choices. We may want to protect our careers and not be subversive, or we want to have them and be very, very practical about them. So we navigate that culture of survivalism. So sometimes you can have students who will talk about, well, I pay high tuition fees, and I understand you pay high tuition fees. You want to come in, get your degree, go and get a good job and raise a nice family. It's a culture of survivalism. Well, if those before us had had that, some of us wouldn't be here. That need to fight. And part of this travelogue is also that entrapment in the capitalist consumption of colonial hierarchies. The who and what is theoretical, who is atheoretical, who is theoretical, who is radical, who is liberal, who is political, who is apolitical, these divides. It's all scripted as part of the entrapment of the capitalist consumption. And of course, that banality of white consciousness. Black existence comes into consciousness through Black males. So we saw what, oh yes, Officer Nabi is all caring about Black existence because what? There's death of George Floyd, and there's Breonna Taylor, or even going back to the 2013 Stephen Lewis or Stephen Lawrence in Britain. And that paradox of access to understand white working class angst and anger, where the white working class is upset with the economic system. Yeah, we should understand it because it's giving them a short shift. We understand it, not just them, every working class. We understand it. But then we want to delegitimize Black pain, suffering and anger and rage. We want us to understand the fears and anxieties, but you don't want to understand our pain and suffering. And what I see with this travelogue is that new coloniality of a Black being flowing from what Winter and Madonna Torres talk about. And I see it along the forefront, this insatiability of consuming Black humanhood through racial capitalism. The colonial logics and that Manichaean divide, the good and the evil. The colonial appellation of African and Black indigeneities. That we raise them and we have to prove that this is a legitimate discourse. So there's a very colonial appellation of what is indigenous. If we don't fall into it, we deny it, we discredit it. And the absented presence of Africanness within Blackness. We cannot understand Blacknesses without centering and situating Africanness in it. So how do I make sense in terms of this experiential? How do I make sense in terms of this experiential? And this gets to the notion of the theorizing the Black experiential. You see Black pain, rage, and resistance in the words of Cheryl Harris, radical relationality, as Black bodies set for stewardship of academic spaces. You have to see our rage, our pain, our resistance in radical relationality. It's also to take anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism, whiteness, and white supremacy as something which is very pervasive throughout academia. And they implicate all of us, everyone. The fact is, the academic can be a risky space for and to talk of Blacknesses because it negates and there's a hostility to Blacknesses. The academy has failed to deeply confront its whiteness and its complicity in the hypervisibility and visibility of Blacknesses. Even when there are those possible spaces of resisting our vulnerability and to be able to celebrate our Blacknesses, we have to be careful because it can end up actually exacerbating our emotional pain. There's that spiritual and psychological wounding of the colonial mimicry that long ago Omi Baba, in the location of culture, talks about. We mimic. We seek validation, we seek acceptance, we seek legitimation in white colonial spaces. And sometimes, in the works of the African scholar Nyamdo, we become intellectual imposters. We are not who we are, our true, authentic self, because we want to be accepted, we want to be validated, we want to be legitimized. Sometimes we mimic theories that hardly speak to our lived experiences, because if we don't cite those theories, there's a cost to our scholarship. Then, of course, the continuing damaging effects of racism and colonialism on the Black psyche, the condition of being constituted as the other in our own, as well as in the hegemonic white psyche. And here's Yuval Davis. That great white mirage, Fanon talked about the terror, bell hooks. Where Black bodies exist in hostile relation to the human, not always considered as human. And there's that constant emotional struggle to stay human, quote human, through our cultural centeredness. As Walter Roney, a long time ago, talked about it, and Joyce Kim, also 2008, talked about that staying human through our cultural centeredness. Notwithstanding what I've said, I still want to hold on to the power of evoking Blackness as spiritual. That power of evoking Blackness as spiritual. And that allows me to think about how we acknowledge Black activism as something which is rooted and grounded in our Blacknesses. To see Blackness, or to see the Black as spiritual, in the sense of the spiritual being relationship centering, and relationship building. We build the relationships among ourselves, creating the communities, and we center these relationships in a spiritual reading. CS had a session last time, and there was something that I picked up from one of the speakers when they talked about, I'm Black. Because I'm Black, I'm an activist. So my activism is rooted in my Blackness. You cannot be that Black and not be an activist. Society puts us that way. Society makes us that way. So to nurture a critical Black thought, what I call a parentology of Blacknesses, which is lodged in active resistance, as well as the escape of Blackness from ethnicity or ethnicity of racial ontology and its precarity and predicament. Dimama Pierre, when he talks about the predicament of Blackness. So the reclaiming of that Blackness will move away from ethnicity in racial ontology, ethnicity of racial ontology, and that predicament which has been put in our way, created. That predicament where it's only possible, or the only possible relationship to the university or to the school is a criminal one. As Martin and Hani talk about, and Maynard also talks about in terms of Black bodies, how they are viewed in the school. The possible relationship is when they are seen as only the criminal one. So how do I bring this thought in terms of reformulation of the spatiality of Blacknesses in academia? How do I tie them in terms of reformulation of the spatiality of Blacknesses in academia? I think we need to recognize the Western Academy and its global satellites. And when we talk of the Western Academy, it's not just simply something in the West or in the North, the global North. We have the colonial satellites in the global South. I mean, there are some of us, I know others have talked about it, right? That, for example, we talk about Africa, for example, and I talk about there are universities in Africa, but we don't have an African university. There are universities in Africa, we don't have an African university because they are colonial satellites of the Western Academy. But the point here is that the Western Academy and its global satellites have been bastions of Euro-coloniality. And there always are discursive chokeholds and space policing. Blackness and anti-Blackness not only secure power and wealth for the dominant, but also reveal guilt and responsibility to work for liberation. And I talk about this in the sense that let's look at our university, for example, where they sit. They sit on indigenous lands. They were constructed using enslaved labor. And yet, Black and indigenous learners always have to appear like we have a cap in hand, begging for something to be done. How do we talk about reparations in this context? To specialize and theorize Blacknesses also in this speciology of Blacknesses in academia, recognizing the intersections of race, difference, space, history, culture, and politics as central organizing principles in this and logics. Take them as central organizing principles. The race, the difference, the space, the history, the culture, the politics, and to be able to work with them as central organizing principles and logics in this speciology of Blacknesses in academia. To understand the speciology of Blacknesses in radical rationality with the intertwined histories of Black, African, Indigenous, Latinx or Latino, and other racialized learners in the academic landscape. Where the academic space could be a site of radicalization and resistance to further the cause of liberation, even as it reveals continuing processes of African and Black dehumanization. For example, that when McKettrick talks of the Black space, the empty out of life. To bring a gaze on the social, spiritual, and psychocultural realms of the Black being in the academy. And to be able to talk of the Black psychic resilience and how it is nourished, how our survival, our resiliency is nourished through African spiritually informed thought, their skin. And to begin to rethink the space-time of Blackness, where time is not racial blank slate, but the space-time of Blackness speaks to that third dimension that I spoke earlier on, which is the fusion of the past, the present, and the future. So it's not hacked by the non-linearity of time as a racialized concept, but it grows into a new grammar of Blacknesses that projects and conjugates different Black futurities. So we think of we reclaim that past, we reflect on the present, and we project onto the future. Reclaim, reflect, and project. The past, the present, and the future. So there's a space-time which is a non-linear, but it's always evoking each other, the three dimensions, as it works into this new grammar of Blacknesses. I want to move now to responding to some of the questions that were raised in the synopsis of the presentation. So asking questions. How does the spatiality of Blacknesses within the confines of academic institutions get instrumentalized? I think the spatial imaging is racially marked in universities. We have to look at it in terms of visuality of Blackness. Where do we find Blacknesses? The spatial imaginary. How is Blackness spatially located? Let's look at the institutions. What are the spaces? The idea of the racial awakening itself, this racial awakening, contributes to the hyper-visibilization of Blacknesses within the spatial imaginary. The ways Blackness comes into academic consciousness. A clear example is when we talk about it in terms of, see how after the George Floyd murder, there was this race to issue solidarity statements. Everybody wants to jump into the act to issue those solidarity statements. And you begin to ask, where have you been all this time? Also, this practice of delegating race issues to Black bodies. But if this is what you want to deal with, then go and see George Day, go and see Jokie Wayne, go and see Lance McCready, go and see Rosalind Hampton. The tropes of academic capitalism that I talked about. The epistemic hijackings and the domestication. If you want to articulate Afrocentricity, then for it to be valid knowledge, it must follow the yardstick which is set up by Western science knowledge. So you begin to ask certain questions framed by that perspective. The violence of erasures and the impact on Black scholar identities. the idea of the monolithic blackness. The blackness without gender, without class, without queer, disability, ability. The geo differences, that there are blacknesses in Latin America, there are blacknesses in Africa, there are blacknesses in the Caribbean, there are blacknesses in the diaspora. The colonial appellation of indigeneity that I talked about. The black lining, I talk about black lining where you put black bodies in camps. So, George in Njoki will be in this camp. Roxlane will be in this other camp. So we put us in camps. And the way the camps are created, they are created and it's manufactured as if we are in constant conflict, tension, competition. I call it a black lining. Allegiances. And so our students are forced that when they work with this group, they cannot go into that group because somehow there's this manufactured conflict between the black bodies in those spaces. The delegitimization of particular forms of Black and African presence. And also the ways institutions use Black bodies and ideas as representation, as ammunition to construct a project of redemption without reparation. It's not just simply how our pictures will be used in terms of the diversity as a calling card. But yes, if certain names are behind certain practices, they are validated and they are legitimized. And through that process, it becomes a project of redemption without reparations. The connections between power and space, and how Black subjects within institutions are carving out spaces to defy white colonial imaginary. This last point is to speak that notwithstanding this speciality of Blacknesses in terms of the confines within academic institutions and how they get instrumentalized, we also have bodies carving spaces to defy that colonial imaginary. How is the historical socialization of whiteness and the territoriality of whiteness contested and resisted by Blacknesses in academia? I think this idea of insistence that lived experiences of race has a spatial dimension, and the lived experiences of spaces has a racial dimension. Part of that insistence is to call into question the way policing. So police is called into certain spaces, surveil certain bodies within institutions. The issue of a predominantly white or white senior institutional leadership and the ways it helps to sustain this culture of whiteness. The Panopticon surveillance on Black bodies, communities, and ideal spaces. This idea of the spatial imaginary of whiteness is ubiquitous. Space gets reconfigured to accommodate the white body, and that white body is the universal body. And you have to look. I do talk about this in the book, and I think I'm reading Disability and Space. You get this reconfiguration of spaces. Optimal technologies and how they are used to discipline racialized bodies in terms of the way spaces were planned and they were designed for white existence to thrive. How the architecture of our campuses can be hostile to the non-white student. You have to look at how statues of colonialists, slave owners, certain paintings, portraits, reminiscent of reminiscent of enlightenment, which also constitute optics of racial hierarchies and speak to visual illusions, how this architecture marked our institutions. That overwhelming presence of whiteness. But again, like the first question, on this second question too, we have to see how resistance plays out in terms of contesting through Black theorizing as oppositional. The idea is that knowing is simply not for its own sake, but knowing is to act. And this is something that Black theorizing takes dearly, that to know is to act. And then we also see the resistance where the space making and the Black geographic imagination and Black aspirations would not be contained. The resistance to not be contained. How do racial spatiality and space making gestures of Blacknesses become forms of institutional accounting? I see this in terms of the extent to which Black scholars do not have the luxury of academic growth. They are held to our earlier writings, and it marks us through our academic trajectories. Even when we have shown growth, they are held to it. Deciding and validating which Black voices need to be heard. Which voices are more scholarly? Which voices are more intellectual? Which voices are more theoretical? And which voices are not angry and they are not in your face? Validating what constitutes Black excellence and its merit badges. Within some institutions, even the celebration of Black history, when there's institutional support for the celebration of Black history, there's an institutional accounting that is required. So I recall it's a case, a scenario where I'll be invited to speak at the Black History Month, and I'll be told, well, it's a time for celebration, so maybe you should tone it down because it's a time to just kumbaya. And I would say, well, I forgot to bring my orchestra. African history is a time for us to reflect, project, but also to be honest and have courageous conversations that will implicate us. Not just in terms of who is doing it, not just in terms of why only a specific period is assigned, but also the failure to understand what white history means for understanding our collective existence. Also, fundraising initiatives, rather than dipping into existing institutional coffers or endowments. Well, we want to do something to address this issue. Well, then maybe we should what? Fundraise for it. Well, let's dip into the coffers that the institutions already have. Not just be saddled with fundraising. That unless we fundraise for it, we can't have it. Let's dip into the coffers that are already there. Then, of course, the racial ventriloquism that I talked about. That's speaking for. Doing something for, rather than doing with us, speaking with us. How are Black scholars envisioning and architecturing new technologies for space making that allow for the insurrection and unruly Black scholar to be and inhabit space in academia? We see it in terms of Black student, faculty, community, contract, subvert, they circumvert, they restrict, they take charge of everyday practices of entangled spatial infrastructures that have removed us in the first place. We see it when we claim taking up space. We also see it in terms of when we engage in that self-referential politics of identity and identification. When we form the Black groups and associations on campuses in solidarity with Indigenous and other racialized groups, because we are creating the spaces for ourselves. The recent calls for centers of Black studies, it's a clear case in mind, or to have academic specializations, that's to African studies on campuses. What I'm trying to get at is that against all the odds, Black faculty, students, and staff have, and they continue to carve out spaces to function. What does a politicized reclaiming of Blacknesses in academia mean in the challenges and possibilities? I think one thing is very, very clear, to be unapologetic about Blackness. I am a Black scholar. I'm not someone running to say I'm a scholar, period. No, I'm a Black scholar, and I'm proud to say that I'm a Black scholar. But also making the connection between the Black scholar and Black scholarship, because they are not the same. You can be a Black scholar, but not working on Black scholarship. So we need to work on the connection, and working on the connection is addressing questions of relevance, questions of responsibility, questions of ethics. Also to see Blackness and indigeneity in radical, discursive, and political relationalities. And also to think and act with our children in mind. Always we have to look forward to think and act with our children in mind. The younger generation and the next generation unborn, have that in mind. And to engage in the challenges to the institutionalized culture of, quote, excellence and meritocracy. Definitions of what is knowledge, how technology should be produced, interrogated, validated, and disseminated locally, nationally, and internationally. So I'll come back to the question, are there redeeming qualities in the spaces we occupy? And I see these qualities in terms of the possibilities of new Black futurities. The idea that something different is possible, but also another possible is possible. Something different is possible, but also another possible is possible. We talk of Black and Indigenous bodies in anti-colonial solidarities, where we understand that there can be no Black liberation without Indigenous sovereignty, and vice versa. And to learn from the lessons of global social movements. Black Lives Matter. There are so many lessons for us to learn. And some of these lessons have to do with connecting struggles. Struggles over racial justice, racial criminalization, police brutality, with questions of capitalism, patriarchy, housing, employment, health, land, and environment. This idea of connection struggles. And to talk about the resurgences of Black courage and activism. And of course, forging bonds of critical friends. And these critical friends are not just indigenous, racialized. They can also be white. But they come to the struggle with a clear understanding that this is something that they are implicated and they are complicit in. So what do I mean, coming to the end, the challenges for the Black scholar? A long time ago, Vincent Harding talks about a critical positioning, repositioning in the academy. I think it holds today. I think we need to talk about our critical repositioning in the academy. What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be an African scholar today? It also calls for understanding the consequences of Black scholar complexities in our academic capitalist cultures. We can be in, but not be made of it. That courage to speak on race and difference. The courage to speak on race and difference. And to be in that constant struggle to resist Black lives as a life living in the white terror, the hooks, and not to be magnetized by whiteness or white privilege, and to create what Asante talked about, that victorious consciousness of the Black cultural space, not to be magnetized by whiteness and white privilege. But also to recognize that whiteness affects feeling and thinking. And therefore, it requires attention to the relation between affect, race, and space to make room for Black affect, to feel and think, as Escobar talks about. To be aware of the appropriation and cooptation of Black pain, Black rage, and Black anger, and our radicalism from the true meaning of what it was intended. That Black rage, Black pain, and anger, the true meaning and purpose is about liberation. We're claiming that intellectual power of retelling, restoring our tales, our narratives, and our experiences in a project of Black rehumanization. Excavating and uncovering the buried rich treasure troves of Black history, Black culture, and our Black intellectual traditions, as has been articulated by some of our pioneering scholars, Manny Marable, Cedric Robinson, Dubois, Marcus Garvey, T.L. James, Cooper, Harding, Keane, Gordon, Hooks, Hortense Pilles, Asante, Robin Kelly. To see it as liberatory or liberation pedagogy. To interrupt the continuum of a relentless white spatial imaginary that undermines Black life and points us towards the specialization of reparations and restructuring the places we live. I think part of our task is going to be looking at Black academic relational mentorship as key to our collective survival. Bringing each other up rather than be in competition with each other. Supporting our young scholars who are coming. The scholars will pass the torch on to them. Mentoring them, because as we mentor them, they are mentoring us. We are not in competition with each other. The academy makes us that way, but to resist that. To bring each other up. A recognition also that simply having that shared consciousness of Blacknesses by itself would not guarantee political solidarity. No, it won't. It will not guarantee academic success, neither would it guarantee liberation. Just simply through that shared consciousness of Blacknesses. Action is required. That consciousness must translate into action. And lastly, to recognize the room for critical friends in the struggle. For example, that dominant struggles or dominant scholars whose intellectual politics is not about white desirability, white sympathy, or that savior mentality complex can be part of the journey forward, that Black futurity. And so I conclude from where I began. Activating the discursive power of Black thought. That discursive power of Black thought is very important, activating that. Also to begin to think about how a spatialization of reparations would look like in the university space. It will require unmarking the geography of exclusion and the historical obligations of university leadership that will surpass the written word. What Sir Ahmed talks about, that performances, the empty talk, the performances, to unmark it. It will also mean we become academic warriors, as I talked about in 2012. In the spirit of Walter Rodney, when he talks about guerrilla intellectuals who are at work liberating spaces. And being able to connect the Black scholar with Black scholarship, because the two are not necessarily synonymous. And connecting that will help us to address questions of responsibility, relevance, and the distortions of Black scholarship. And finally, to uphold the idea that Develos expresses, that beautiful idea, that powerful idea, that quote, where there are Black people, there is and there must be Black resistance. Why is this so important? It is important because our silence itself is violence. Thank you. Asante sana.
Thank you, Professor Day. That was exceptional. So I'd like to begin by providing a short summary, and then we'll open up for questions. I believe there's some questions that have been posed to Professor Day. The discussions have been live. For those of you that are on social media, thank you for your participation. So Professor Day began with locating the self and what it means to be a Black intellectual, right? And he positioned this idea of speaking differently, right? And the philosophical grounding of what it means to be Black in the very academy that is structurally and institutionally anti-Black in of itself, right? So he maps out the space that the academy is all about knowledge, and academy is also connected to questions of identity, embodiment, how bodies are understood as they walk through. And he positions this idea of being the Black academic as someone who's constantly at war with the very academy that is trying to annihilate the Black existence, the Black humanity, right? He talked about the many narratives about anti-Blackness, right, and how it's structured, and that the very idea of being Black, as he put it, is rooted within the continent of Africa, but that also Blackness is not one thing. It's not monolithic. There are many different types of Blacknesses, and that we as a collective need to work towards not only speaking to the difference of Blackness that we have within Blackness and our community, but also address Afrophobia and the ways in which there's the amputation of everything that's African, that you could either be African or Black, right? And he also mapped out geographies of Blackness, right, from plantations to the diaspora, to position ideas about race, power, and Blackness and nationality, right, to mark Blackness globally within the past, present, and the future, right? And he asks, how do we create intellectual spaces for Blackness? What does this Blackness mean as far as collective, as far as community, and as far as responsibility? And he poses questions about the Black academic, right? That not every Black academic is working towards Black scholarship, right? There's a reward, as he put it, in terms of speaking race, speaking Blackness, and Eurocentric mimicry. He also talked about this constant need for many to escape this Blackness because of the Eurocentric violence that they're experiencing, and that the academy as a Eurocentric colonial institution is not an exception. So the question is then, how do you build these spaces? How do we not compete, and how do we work together for a future in a Black collective that is whole, that is humanistic, and that is not always in competition. That is the nature of Black spirituality and being Black in the academy. So I'll pass it over to Rukia, and you'll ask the first question, or
Nana, we're going to turn to you first. Would you like us to stop for a break? Or are you good? You going to power through?
Oh, okay. Just give me just 2 minutes.
Okay. So we'll do while Nana comes back. So we recognize that there were questions that were put in the Q&A. So as mentioned before, the questions that we're going to ask were questions that participants through their registration process included in their registration. So all the questions that are within the chat right now, there are some, as we engage in the questions, you'll notice that they'll be addressed. And we are hoping that as you were engaging in the conversation with us tonight, that some of your thoughts and curiosities were also addressed. Regardless, we are going to compile all of these questions, and as mentioned in the beginning, they will help to inform future Sears events. So continue asking the questions. We may not answer the questions entirely that were raised within the Q&A, but we will definitely address some of the questions that were posed during the registration process. The time is 7:36, so we'll have time for a couple questions. And then any of the other questions that, again, we aren't addressing, we'll definitely include it within the future Sears events. So we're ready to go, Nana?
Yes.
Okay. So the first question, and this question came from three individuals, and we compressed them into one question because many of the ideas were similar. So the question goes, given the ways in which the spatiality of Blackness is instrumentalized within institutions, how might we, current and emerging scholars, imagine the future of Black Canadian studies at this time? And how might emerging scholars navigate such terrain? So as I was thinking about this question from the individuals that posed, I was referring back to some of the key themes that you brought up and examining the ways in which spaces are produced. So Blackness has been central to both the production of space and the development of knowledge. So in that process, how do we ensure that, as one of my mentors says, as we engage in my day-to-day work with the TDSB, Ms. Karen Murray, she often talks about counter spaces, and counter spaces promoting psychological well-being of individuals who experience the oppression. So the importance of narrative identity work, going back to what Dr. Ilmi and what you mentioned around Black scholars not necessarily engaging in Black scholarship. So what does it mean to be authentic to your true self and engage in that scholarship that you know will then take all the different fragments and make you whole? And then also within how do we destabilize knowledge as we continue to redevelop and explore questions of relevance, responsibility, and ethics within our work. So now I'm going to ask you that question. So how do we imagine the future of Black Canadian studies at this time, and how might emerging scholars navigate the terrain?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think to me is this is something to have ongoing conversations, right, about, right? It's good to have ongoing. But certain things are very, very clear in terms of how we move forward on that, right? I think one thing which is very, very clear is I think the Black presence on Turtle Island, right, is something that is worth pursuing, right? So I can see Canadian Black studies, right, dealing with that question of the Black presence on Turtle Island. But also then the question of Africanness, in the construction of that Canadian Black studies that we're talking about, right? So where do we locate it? Where do we place it? But it's not just the Africanness or the Africa. It's also the whole question of the Black presence in global spatiality. So when we talk about it, we talk about Latin America, Caribbean, right? Europe, right? So to bring that sense into conversations also become that. And it's part of what I've always talked about, which is the question of engaging the cartographies of Blacknesses in the studies that we do. Right? But it will be also interesting to see in terms of how we move on this, right? What would it mean, right, for Black studies to intervene in the conception of our disciplines? So for Black studies to intervene in law, right, to intervene in social work, to intervene in health, education. So I think Canadian Black studies, right, engage in that question of intervention, that what would it mean? And that would move beyond simply the question of, say, it has to be an interdisciplinary approach. It's more than that. It's about what is the content of this discipline, what is being taught, right? Of course, for me, from my area, right, being somebody who's in education, I think to me, Black studies in education definitely would be something that I think, to me, when we talk of Canadian Black studies, right? What is this place in the area of education? But to, like I said, to build not just in terms of the Tesla land, but connections with other places. And then also community engagement, right? Local community engagement, because I think to me, when talking about Canadian Black studies, this is going to rupture what things that have been done. Then you have to find place for community knowledge to be able to work with and engage community in research. It will have to be a different way of doing things as usual. That's being done in the academy. Right? And I noticed when you talk about the whole question of the past, right? How do we have it the past in constructing this Canadian Black cities, right? And also how do we ensure that, for example, we think and act on it, not just with the present, but with our children and the future generation in mind, in this conceptualization of what. And that's what I mean by when it has to be ongoing critical conversations around it. Right? But it's a healthy conversation that has begun, and people are talking about it. It's too bad. I mean, people now think they saw it because of what has happened. No, this is something that people have been saying for years, that we need to have this, right? And I think, to me, to continue the dialogue and to talk about it would be very, very important. Because there is brilliant scholarship around that can be harnessed and to think through what these studies would look like, right? Which would be a radical departure from what we have.
I think, thank you, Nana. So as you were speaking, I was thinking about your initial point around the importance of activating the disruptive power of Black thought, and ensuring that it's interwoven across disciplines, as opposed to a siloed subject or area of study. And it reminds me of Bell Hooks and the way in which she talks about language. And how she says that, how Bell Hooks says that language disrupts and refuses to be contained within pre-constructed boundaries or binaries. So recognizing that within all of these areas of study, they're pre-constructed and pre-packaged in particular ways. As opposed to having a siloed area of study, how do we ensure that it's interwoven so we can engage in that transactional relationship with knowledge production and knowledge dissemination?
Yeah, and part of that would be asking new questions, right?
Yes.
I mean, language has to empower us. Language must empower us to ask new questions, right? And the gaze that we bring to those questions. So there has to be critical conversations about it.
Definitely. So we're going to go to, you kind of talked about this when you were engaging in the conversations around cartographies of Blacknesses and indigeneity. But there were a few individuals upon registration who asked the question, how do we interrogate Blacknesses to ensure common meanings in anti-racism approaches or discourses? So this is looking at two levels in a more nuanced fashion. So looking at multiple oppressed identities. So where does intersectionality fit within this conversation? But also the ways in which anti-Black racism is experienced by African people on the continent, but also individuals who identify themselves as African American or African Canadian, born and raised in North America.
Yeah. No, I think to take the first part of it, right, it's around the intersectionality, right? I think people talk about the nuances of Blackness, right? The multidimensionality of Blackness. Right? It's about what Blackness is monolithic, right? So we can't talk about Blackness without looking at the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, disability. And I think that's very, very powerful to work with, right? But part of that multidimensionality is also to engage it in terms of the geographies, the different geographies of Blacknesses, right? So like I said, the Afro-descendants in Latin America, we engage that, right? What does it mean? But also to relate it to conversations of, say, Abiyala or the Mestizos, right, in that context. But also to engage it also not just Latin America, but also Caribbean, the continent itself, and Europe, that global Black diaspora, and so that the conversations have meaning. They may play out in terms of the specificities, right? They do have resonance. The issues do have resonance. And that then leads to the second question about, for example, say in Africa, right? Let's look at Black Lives Matter, right? Black Lives Matter is not just a North American issue. It is an issue on the continent itself, right? Recently, people will talk of the NSAS in Nigeria, right? The police brutality. But I think it's more than that. I talk about the chokeholds in terms of, let's look at how Black bodies are able to survive on the continent, right? The questions of poverty, the questions of environment, the questions of employment and so forth, right? Look, if Black Lives Matter, they have to matter in terms of being able to survive, being able to exist, being able to actualize their dreams. So it's something which is global, and I think we need to look at. But also, I think when we talk about this notion, the critique that I offered around whiteness, right? We do have it also in Africa, right? We do have it in Africa where there's a worshiping of whiteness, right? There's a worshiping of whiteness. And we have to look at the worshiping of whiteness through that Black-white prism that I spoke about, where that proximity to whiteness is rewarded and the proximity to Blackness is punished, right? It's something Johal talked about, that pigmented passport of privilege, right? It's global, it's everywhere. It opens doors. And what happens is that racial ventriloquy that I talked about, right? Certain voices count, the white voice in Africa, that imperial savior voice, right, counts in that. But there's also another mention to that, which is also to talk about, look, when we talk about anti-Black racism, right, we also have to talk about anti-African racism, right? Because sometimes we internalize the tropes and revisit it on each other, right? So we need to also talk about it, that anti-Blackness will also have to engage anti-Black racism, right? And that means then that we broaden the conversation to be able to look at it in that context. I think to me, it's very, very important for us to do that, not just because of the global seduction of whiteness, but it's also about the denial of the African humanity, which is a global problem, a global issue that we have to address. It's more than just the black colored descriptor, right? It's about significations and also questions about what symbols mean in this case. And I think it's very, very important. Look, anti-black racism even exists in the black majority context in Africa. It does exist in the black majority context in Africa. I think this is why we need to be able to look at it, because there are colonial hierarchies everywhere. Colorism is a problem. Colonial hierarchies are there. Anti-black racism is there. Anti-African racism is there, and so forth. And this culture of anti-blackness, where the culture of anti-blackness, the preference for everything that is white and is European.
I think that from your response, it's making me reflect on the multiple ways in which the body is a moving signifier that transcends borders or boundaries. And the whole notion of self-actualization is so critical, regardless of where we are within the spaces in which we occupy. And it begs a question then, how do we affirm life in global context? What does it mean to affirm life? And what does that entail? I know we have time for one other question. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Ahmed, and you can decide which one that we're going to address and the other one that we're going to keep for future events.
I think I'm going to go with the third question. And I think, George, you've kind of addressed it a bit when you spoke about Blackness in North America and the question of Indigenous sovereignty. And it's a very, very important question now that has emerged in terms of Black solidarity with Indigenous communities and how essentially the colonial struggles were tied through. So the question is, what is the role of solidarity between Black and Indigenous peoples in the academy?
I think Black and Indigenous solidarity is not a phrase, right? It's not a phrase. We know alliances have always existed, right? And I think we need to be able to look at how this alliance, the history behind the alliances, and learn from the lessons. I like Harry's point about that discursive and political relationalities that we need to draw, right? That radical relationalities between Black and indigeneity. As I said in my presentation, right? Black liberation is meaningless without Indigenous sovereignty, and vice versa, right? I think they have to go hand in hand. And that means that in talking about this solidarity, we acknowledge the land on which we actually work this solidarity out, right? So for me, when we talk about Black Indigenous solidarity here, we acknowledge the land on which we're talking about Black Indigenous solidarity and the politics that come with that, and how, for example, in reclaiming the African indigeneity to recognize that. I also think if you want to talk about Black and Indigenous solidarity, then there must be room also to talk about the cartographies of indigeneity that I spoke about, right? That cartographies of indigeneity, that because that's the way to link up the issues, and also the questions of relationships and respect is going to be very, very important in that alliances and those linkages and the solidarity, right? Relationships that see us in terms of what Ahmed was talking about, where we don't fall into this colonial trap, this divides, right? The competition where we think our issues are competing with the other issues, and that to see them as connected. But then also the relationship that also recognizes that our existence, right, requires that we work in that solidarity, because the colonial project has always been to pit us against each other and to make us as if we are each other's enemy, rather than see us in terms of how we are being scripted by the whole project, whether it's settler colonialism or it's other forms of colonialism. And then respect has to be part of it. Respect. And I think to me, when I talk about that respect, it's also acknowledging our complicities in each other's oppression, right? To acknowledge our complicities in each other's oppression, right? Look, when we talk about anti-blackness, right? Anti-blackness implicates all of us, everyone, right? So to acknowledge that, the global, Just as I want to acknowledge, right, how I can be very complicit in anti-indigeneity, I want indigenous bodies also to recognize that their complicity and implications in anti-blackness, right? And that is how we build solidarities. We build solidarities that resist the competition, resist the manufactured device, right? Divide and conquer, right? And be able to do that. And this is going to be the challenge that we do that, because I think when we look at our institutions, right, our institutions would like to see us as if we don't get along, right? Like to see us as if we don't get along. And that has always been, and sometimes we fall into that trap, right? Rather than see how we connect the struggles, we connect the issues, and that. And it has to be based on respect, mutual respect, building relationships, but also recognizing the land, the importance of the land. Look, the importance of the land for indigenous peoples here, so also is it for African peoples in the continent, for Black peoples, and that. So to recognize that, what are the teachings of the land and how do they manifest themselves in different spaces, right? Become very important in that project. And I think it's so important for us to be able to look at it this way. I think our stories are intertwined, right? There's some particularity to our stories, but they are intertwined. They are intertwined. And so is our future. Our stories are intertwined, our future is intertwined. You also have to recognize that just as there are Afro-Indigenous scholars, there are also African Indigenous scholars, right, who are concerned about these issues. We need to look at it in terms of how we come together and build on the momentum and come together and address these issues. We need to look at the issues not just here on Untitled land, but also in Latin America, because there's question of Black indigenous solidarity in Latin America is as in other parts of the globe.
Right, and the idea that essentially Blackness is not responsible for the colonial project and that land theft has taken place across the globe. So everywhere you go, the indigenous and the Black and the others always being displaced, right? And the rest of the world is actually fighting for their humanity. And within those collective voices, there's room for the indigenous struggle, the Black struggle, the African, all the struggles for humanity that are non-white.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I mean, I talk about in my classes where I talk about, for example, yes, I want to talk about African indigeneity, but I also want to be mindful where I'm talking about it, where I'm speaking about it, right? You know, on Untitled land to speak about what does it mean, right? To not make myself implicated and complicit in indigenous, indigenous, the sort of the genocide, the denial of indigenous sovereignty and all that, right? How does the state use the Black body to further a particular colonial project, right? To do that, and I think being aware of that. But having said that, doesn't mean that I cannot talk about my African indigeneity, right? Because as I've argued that our indigeneity do not leave the body; they reside in us. It's on cultural memory, right? There's a reason why we have African mothers and fathers who will go to Lake Shore to pour libation, because the understanding is that in the Middle Passage, right, their ancestors who were thrown overboard, as far as they know, the bodies could have swum and it's now resting at Lake Shore. So again, he talks about this issue about the traveling, right, and how indigenous should be seen in that question, that the land is very, very important, not just a physical location, it's spiritual, social, cultural relations that we need to.
Thank you to you
Thank
both.
you, George.
And then as both of you were speaking, going completely full circle back to the question of what institution is worth fighting for. As we search for meaning, rediscovery, and authentic self-affirmation, it also goes back to the statement made by Nana around reclaiming the past, but reflecting on the present in order to project onto the future. So thinking about what is it, what are the redeeming qualities, or what is it that we're trying to project onto the future through decolonial solidarity. So I recognize the time. So we'd like to say.
Can I just make a point on that?
Of course.
I think that the whole question about the search for rehumanization, right? That search for rehumanization. Our humanity has always been under assault. There's always a constant assault on our humanity, and I think we need to struggle to rehumanize, to claim it back, to get it back, right? And that means for Black learners, for Indigenous learners, we need to know about the contributions of our stories, contributions of our life, right? Contributions of our histories, just as we talk about our contributions of our science and philosophies, to be able to know about that. But also to the question of the mentorship, right? We can't do this journey. We can't go on this journey simply by ourselves. We have to mentor people along the way, because through the project of mentorship, we not only mentor ourselves, we mentor others, right? And therefore we continue. We have the baton, not only the baton chaining, but also there's a continuation of the knowledge and the projects that go with it. And this is why I come back to the point about the Black radicality, right? That question of the Black radical thought, right? How we need to be very, very fearless. We have to be fearless in our search for knowledge and in our politics, right? Sometimes I talk about the cowarding, right? The others we talk about intellectual cowardice, right? The intellectual gymnastics. We don't want to name issues for what they are, right? Because we don't want to get people upset. We want to ruffle feathers, and that has not gotten us anywhere. I think we need to be fearless. We need to be courageous. We need to talk about liberating spaces. So to come back to what universities worth fighting for, right? We need to talk about that, the possible and the possibility of that possible, right? Talk about it.
What a great way to end the conversation, I must say. You always have this way of words that me thinking more and more and more, and I'm cognizant of time, but I really want to say, well, what is your version of possibility? But we don't. So I want to say thank you, Nana, and thank you to Ahmed, and thank you all to everyone who is participating in the conversation tonight. Thank you for spending your Friday evening with us.
Yeah, and thanks to all of you. I mean, I've learned a lot from my students in particular, and some of whom are now big names, scholars in their own right, rupturing where they are. And I think I've learned a lot, and I do appreciate that. So I'm really grateful.
We want to make just a few quick announcements before we close out for tonight. First, we'd like to thank Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute for partnering with Sears to help make Sears and Combo possible. So as mentioned before, this is the third conversation within our series. Our next one will be on Black leadership. It'll take place around February, March at the latest. So please stay in tune. And as Sears coordinators and individual volunteers within Sears have been including in the chat, we publish newsletters the first week of every month, and you can also find them on the website. All the information is available via Twitter as well. Currently, we have around 5,000 newsletter readers. So if you are interested in accessing the newsletter, please just share your information, and that way we can ensure that you have access to the newsletters. We also know that within the Q&A, there have been many individuals that have been asking about the slide decks. So two things in relation to the slide deck. The first is that this webinar is currently being recorded. So you will have access to this on the Sears website, but also on YouTube as well. So if you'd like to have the conversation along with the slides, because the slides don't encompass everything that was explored during the webinar, that is going to be available to you shortly. But also if you would like access to the slides themselves, please leave your contact information, and then we will ensure that we get the slides to you as soon as they are formatted in a way that renders them accessible to everyone. So if that's something that you're interested in, please share your contact information. Lastly, we would like to thank our incredible team at Sears for organizing tonight's event, and we invite them to come on camera. Thank you to Nana, thank you to Ahmed for moderating this with me. Thank you to OISE and the Department of Social Justice Education for engaging in this conversation with us. And on behalf of Sears, thank you all for spending your Friday evening We will see you again with our next webinar exploring Black leadership around February, March time. And we hope you have a blessed night and a phenomenal weekend. We also hope that you and yours are safe and healthy. And thank you for engaging in this conversation with us. Have a good night, everyone.